Hello, everybody. Welcome to Profiling Evil Podcast with this episode titled The Witch is Dead. You know, for more than 20 years, cult leader Anne Hamilton-Byrne led a cult called The Family. Using her sexual prowess, beauty, and her charismatic nature, Hamilton-Byrne groomed a host of doctors, physicists, scientists, and psychiatrists, along with common folk, to do her bidding. Eventually, more than 500 people would flock to the cult's headquarters in Lake Eildon, Victoria, to join the cult. These cult members would ultimately give everything they had to the woman that they revered as a god. Well, today we're talking with the police investigator who's credited with breaking up this group and arresting the manipulative and predatory leader. Please join me in welcoming Lex De Man. Lex, how are you today?
Good, thanks, Mark. How are you?
Doing really well. You know, it's interesting. We became friends just, 6 months ago or so. And since then, having social media and sharing that, I've really come to know you and the amazing work that you're doing over there. Thanks again for taking time out. And from one cop to another, isn't it odd how you can be halfway around the world and yet immediately sense a brotherhood when you deal with another cop?
Yeah, it is, Mike. And your background and my background when it comes to cults is very similar. So it's nice to meet somebody else from the brotherhood, if I can put it that way, without being derogatory towards those that are in the police forces that are both female and male. But it's great to be able to, and it's been great meeting you.
Well, yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. This particular specialty that we developed as a result of our assignments is really rather unique, and to be able to be among a group of people that have investigated and kind of understand cult mentality and cult behavior and dynamics is pretty darn rare in our profession, isn't it?
It is, because not every day of the week that a police officer would investigate a cult. And I was fortunate or unfortunate, same as yourself, to get involved in some of the worst crimes that people could commit against other people.
Yeah, agreed. Well, folks, let me just tell you a little bit about Lex De Man. He is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Victoria Police Legacy in Melbourne, Australia. Lex is a retired law enforcement and fire professional who's a recognized investigator. He's the former mayor of Nillumbik Shire Council, and he holds a Master of Business Administration from La Trobe University. He's the recipient of some of Australia's most prestigious awards, including the Outstanding Service Medal and the National Emergency Medal. Again, Lex, thanks for joining to the show. And I just want to ask you if we could jump right in and tell us a little bit about who Anne Hamilton-Byrne is and how she somehow convinced so many people to follow her in this destructive cult that eventually would obtain, torture, and brainwash children through this incredibly complex matrix of fraudulent adoption schemes. Who is she?
So Anne Hamilton-Byrne was in actual fact a nurse and a yoga teacher. And she was the daughter of a railway worker from one of our little country towns to the east of our state of Victoria in a place called Sale. In the 1960s, Anne met Dr. Raina Johnson, who was a physicist who'd also actually worked on the nuclear program during World War II. And Raina had become the Master of Queen's College here at Melbourne University, which for those listening and watching, Raina, that position, the Master of Queen's College, is the top academic position within the state of Victoria. So Raina was, in the 60s, toying with Eastern mythology, religion, and Christianity and how they came together. He was introduced to Anne at Melbourne University one day, and as soon as he saw Anne, he said he'd met the Messiah. He had seen Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form. So Anne then preyed on that notoriety because she was introduced to some of Melbourne's elite in society in the 1960s. And she then became known by a woman who owned a private psychiatric hospital and a number of psychiatrists who were then experimenting with the drug LSD. And from there, through the use of a private psychiatric hospital here in Melbourne, they built up cult members, which I can talk about. But Anne was a very charismatic person. I met her after 4.5 years when she was arrested in the United States, and I went to the United States to bring her home. But they tell me, her cult followers, she was so charismatic, and she held 500 plus at the height of the cult, based here in Melbourne, Victoria. And for us Victorians, it was many people can't believe it because this is some of the things that we see in the USA or overseas, not in Melbourne. And that's why I want to talk about this story, to let people know that this can happen in your backyard.
Yeah, well, it does happen in our own backyards. And according to experts, there are some 5,000 plus cults at any given time in the world operating. And some are destructive, like this cult was. Others, some people might consider a sports team fanatic as someone involved in a cult. But we're talking serious cult leaders who created organizations that led people down dark paths of abuse. And these cult leaders always seem to do it so that it benefits them and nobody else. One of the things I found interesting about her as I talked to you and did some research is, again, you talked about her coming up from pretty blue collar roots, and all of a sudden she's thrust into meeting with prime ministers and high level people. Not only must this have been just an incredible ego trip for her, but why were they so attracted to her?
Oh, well, many of them through Rayney Johnson, because Rayney Johnson, he's simple who he was and his position in society at Melbourne University gave her credence. As simple as that, and she preyed on that. People in those days took it for granted. They didn't question authorities in those days as we do that now. If you were told this is who this person was, you believed it. And preyed on those in high levels of society, like doctors, nurses, lawyers, judges, etc., who at the time were suffering from mental illness. And in those days, we didn't talk about mental illness. If you were diagnosed with a mental illness, you were sent to an asylum or you lost your career. So hence many of them went to the private psychiatric hospital here in a suburb of Melbourne called Kew. And they would go and see either a Dr. Howard Whittaker or a Dr. John McKay, and they would be administered with the drug LSD for treatment. And then what would happen, they're lying in a darkened room, they've received the drug, the door would open, and there was this figure in a white flowing gown with dry ice in a bucket to make it look as though there was smoke coming up from behind her. And when they came out of the trance, they believed they had seen the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And they would then see Anne in the flesh, and they've seen Jesus Christ. And that's how, very simply, she became devout followers. There was a woman who applied for a cleaning job at Anne's house. And I never forget speaking to this woman in London when I tracked her down in London. And she did an interview for just a simple maid's job, just to clean the house on a Friday. Within a week, she was a member of the cult, and she'd been banished to the United Kingdom with another cult follower. And her husband had been banished to India. They never saw each other for 19 years. This was the power and the charisma that this woman had, apart from what occurred with newborn children.
Yeah, so I find this so interesting. So there were legitimate reasons that people, at least in their mind, were going and having medical treatments that included LSD, which is so strange to think of as a police officer. And in the middle of that, they were so committed to Anne that they were then putting together this scheme where she would come in with dry ice and make her glorious entry. And you know what? Who wouldn't spend the rest of their life thinking they had witnessed something pretty amazing under those circumstances?
Exactly. You know, how the case was broken open was a number of months after the task force, which was started, that I was on. We've learnt that the lawyer, Anne's lawyer, who'd been her devout follower for many, many decades, had left the cult in disgust at Anne, and he suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder. It would take him 3 hours to have a shower, for example. He was just obsessed about cleanliness. And Anne at one stage arranged for a leucotomy for him, that's surgery of the brain through the eye. And he did a lot of the false adoptions, a lot of the land transactions, and he was the key to the case being broken open, if I can put it that way. And it took 3 months and 365 pages of handwritten statement to actually go through all the documents and get the background to Anne from the lawyer.
So, Lex, when I was in college, I actually worked in a psychiatric unit, and one of the things I remember is watching as they did those frontal lobotomies. Now, I didn't sit in on the surgery, but I witnessed what the people went through after and what they went through when they had electric convulsive therapy, the ECT, where they would, back in those days when they would shock them and try to scramble their brains. How challenging was it having someone like that as a witness in a potential court environment, knowing that they had gone through those kinds of things?
Yeah, Peter, with the leucotomy that he had, he was still very high functioning. And that would not have been that would not have been a problem. We actually charged Peter with perjury on some documentation he did for Anne, and that's how he turned what we call here Queen's evidence. He gave evidence on behalf of the Crown because I gave a commitment to him with the approval of our prosecutors that if he told us everything he knew, that I would personally stand up in the court in his court case and be a character evidence witness for him to say how he had cooperated with Victoria Police, which is the first and only time I've ever done that in my career within policing.
Well, that's incredible in and of itself, and what a testament to you and your own personal integrity to know that needed to be done and that it was the right thing to do. You know, folks, I'm talking with Lex De Man. He is a retired investigator from Victoria, Australia. He investigated a group called The Family, a cult that amassed as many as 500 people in a very destructive way, took children from their parents and conducted all kinds of criminal activities. We're talking about how the cult was organized initially, and one of the questions I've got, Lex, is I read, and I believe you and I even talked a little bit about it, that Anne forced the members to give her 10% of their income, perhaps more. Now, running a cult is really expensive. What can you tell me about that, and how were they actually paying their bills and amassing this empire?
So Anne required those that followed her to be devout followers. And so, for example, with the children that she had amassed as her own, as Hamilton-Byrne children up at Lake Eildon, there were 2 women who would spend 2 weeks up at the property and 2 weeks off the property. When they were off the property, they were working as nurses in Melbourne, in one of our leading hospitals, and then they would go back to Eildon and change over. And they had to pay for all the food, the bills, everything to do with the running of that particular household, and never touched a cent, never paid a cent. And that was their way of supporting Anne. When Anne bought property overseas, in the Catskill Mountains in the United States, in upstate New York, and also in the United Kingdom, followers went across and did the renovations on the house to make them very, very livable, can I say, for Anne, who many thought had some form of royal background as well. It was just bizarre the power that she had. So Anne never paid for anything, and yet she amassed a fortune of millions and millions and millions of dollars. Which in the end, when she passed away at an age of 98, she no longer had. But that's another story. But people just did what they were asked or told, should I say, and provided for Anne and her husband. And Anne was never short of a dollar.
It's interesting in these cults, and yours is so similar to the cult that I investigated, that while everything goes to the leader, the self-proclaimed leader, no less, it seems like the only person that is moving ahead is the leader. Everyone else is just kind of suffering and going, but there's such a devotion, and she promised them eternal life. She promised them that they would actually have responsibilities of teaching others how to live in this utopian world. Now, they were doomsdayers, weren't they?
Well, and one of the reasons why Anne apparently amassed the group of children was that she wanted to put them into various levels of society in our parliaments and so forth. They're all their hair was, except for one, their hair was peroxide blonde, so they all looked the same. For those that are hearing and looking at this podcast, Anne, if you can imagine the Von Trapp family singers, and you multiply that by around about 13 children, they all had the same clothes, they all looked the same and so forth, and she wanted to put them out into society in their old age to continue on with the cult and take charge of society. That was one of her bizarre philosophies that we learned during the investigation. So, and with Anne, I agree, Mike, the thing I've learned is two things that Anne was about. It was about control and money. And I think if you look at most cults, if not all cult leaders, that's what it's about. It's about controlling the mind, in other words, controlling others and securing their wealth. And at the end of the day, that's what occurred.
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly the same kind of thing that I saw, is this absolute control in everything they do, who they associate with, how their money is spent. In many cases, it's giving all of their money when they get their paycheck, usually from menial jobs, when you're talking about the moms of these children that were given up. Now, your cult was unique because you also had high functioning professionals who were in the leadership of that cult.
Correct. Many of those in the leadership roles were highly professional. So, for example, with a number of the children that became Hamilton-Byrne children, they were born to unmarried mothers who were 15, 16, 17 years of age, who'd fallen pregnant. And in those days, there was no welfare support, and it was taboo for an unmarried girl to become a mother. So they were secreted by their own parents, to shunned out of society, sent to a couple of doctors in the hills, one in particular, and where they were told, the unmarried mothers and their parents were told, look, the children will go into loving homes, be adopted. After the birth, you'll be able to go home and no one will be the wiser. And imagine then many, many years later, me as an investigator going along and knocking on the door and saying, I'm from Victoria Police. Did you give birth to a child 18 years ago, 19 years ago, 15 years ago? And the look of horror on their face was that mother was the only one that knew what had happened to her. And then asking the next question, I would like a sample of your blood to be taken by a doctor. It was the first time in our state the DNA testing was actually really, really used. And then the shock of horror then finding the father and saying to the father, did you know that you possibly were the father of a child? No. Getting the DNA, matching the two and saying that they're the real parents. And then having to tell that news to the child, who for years and years and years always believed that Anne and William Hamilton-Byrne were their parent.
Yeah. So, tell me about that. How did you tell them? Yeah. When you told them, what was the response?
Well, the response was, from the mothers and the fathers. The fathers was just disbelief, like the mother. The mothers. A couple of doors I knocked on with members of the team. When the door opened, there was one in particular I saw. The woman opened the door, and I was looking at the child. Just the resemblance was just remarkable. So even before I asked for the blood, I knew what the outcome would be. And a couple of them, they reconnected with their maternal parents and so forth. And many of the children who I now call survivors, they've gone on and had families of their own, and they're living some great lives. But, their early lives were shattered, and the way that they were treated up at Eildon and by the cult, and really taken around the world by Anne under a misnomer that they all belonged to Anne, was absolutely cruel.
Oh, I can't imagine. And this is another really unique thing that you and I share as investigators, is we actually know the adult children that we rescued decades ago. And that's a pretty remarkable experience to see them and see the challenges they've faced in their life. We sometimes as policemen just are so focused on the crime that we forget about the humanity side of it and what their lives must be like.
I remember when I first got involved through a fire that I was investigating back in 1987, and I started to learn a little bit about the cult and that action hadn't been taken in those days to look into the cult. I remember one of our police physicians, a police doctor, saying to me, "Don't get involved. Because if you get involved, this will be with you for the rest of your life." Now, that was in 1987. Here we are in 2021, and I'm still involved. I still have contact with several of the survivors, the former children, and other cult members who contact me at times, and I still get inquiries from women who gave their children up for adoption in the 1970s, 80s, wondering to know, was my child one of those children?
This cult was amassing a huge operation that extended from Australia to the United States to the United Kingdom. There were holdings that at the time that my understanding is, Lex, at the time this all fell apart, exceeded more than 150 million Aussie dollars, 150 million Aussie dollars.
Yeah, I couldn't give an estimate figure, but it was a very wealthy cult, and she was a very wealthy woman.
Yeah, and the cult leader we're talking about is Anne Hamilton-Byrne. Lex, so you end up going to this fire at a school, and you start to get inklings of what's going on with the children. As the allegations of abuse are surfacing, Victoria Police launch what they determine will only be a short-term operation called Operation Forest. Tell me about that short-term operation.
So, as I said, 87, I went, December 87, I went to the school fire, and the local police had tried to get the department to look into the whole activity of the cult. The children had been released in the August of that year, and then I came along in the December, and the children were in state care, and I got to know the circumstances. I'd never heard of this bizarre cult. And, this woman, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, who was supposed to be Jesus Christ. So after 3 months of investigating the fire, I was told by my superiors to drop it and move on to something else, because the cult had nothing to do with fire. So when I was in the arson bomb squad, but I kept looking through it in 1988 and early 1989. And in June 1989, an opportunity arose where I was asked to do a report on the cult in that particular part of the state. So I did the report, but I used a couple of phrases, knowing that the department could no longer ignore not doing something. So I used alleged child stealing, alleged administration of LSD on children, alleged falsification of official documents. So in the December of 1989, I received a phone call to say, "We're setting up Operation Forest, this task force. Yourself, a senior sergeant who was the in charge, who was a terrific fellow by the name of Peter Spencer. Learnt so much from Peter, and 4 detectives. I remember we walked into a small room in police headquarters. We had desks, 4 chairs, 4 filing cabinets, no typewriters, no papers, no car, and we were told you've got 12 weeks to investigate it. So some 4.5 years later, I was the sole survivor of the original 6 on the task force, and by then I'd been appointed the senior investigator, and brought Anne and William back. But it was just, in those days, police departments didn't know how to cope with this. It was a child welfare matter, not a police department matter. And I can very, very comfortably say now the approach now by Victoria Police is completely different than it has been for many years. But yeah, so we were given 12 weeks, and 4.5 years later, I finished up after we brought Anne and William back, and there was 13 people that went through the task force throughout the period of the task force.
That's amazing when you think about a 12-week operation that ends up in reality going 200 plus weeks. As you go back and if you could kind of paint a picture about the raid when police, local, state, and federal stormed the compound, what was accomplished there, and how did Anne and her husband get away?
So at the time of the raid, there was some interest in August 87. There was some interest about the Eildon property, and Anne had fled the country already and gone to the United Kingdom to her property in Kent at Tunbridge Wells called Broome Farm. But William had stayed behind, and the children were secreted at Eildon. There was a false floor that the children would be put into a crevice at the bottom underneath the house, because the children were told such things that if police come along and knock on the door, we've got to hide you, because the role of police in society is just simply to shoot children. So the children were terrified. So one of the children escaped, and she left the house, and she was located by the local police officer, and it was a very small community with just a couple of police officers. He then told the local, what we call here, community policing squad, as it was then, the local police women's division, and because in those days they were segregated police women, policemen, and they arranged with the federal authorities, including the Department of Health and Community Services, to go to the Eildon property one morning based on what they had been told about the children and what allegedly had happened with the beatings and the dunkings of children's heads and so forth. So when they arrived early in the morning, they raided the property, and there was an auntie there, one of the aunties, and the children were in bed, and the children were terrified. Of course they were terrified, because the police had come to get the children, and they had a police doctor with them and a couple of other social workers. So the children were removed from the property, and William then tried to get the children back through our children's court, but the courts were smart enough not to do that. And sometime after, Bill fled the country because there was no charges pending against Bill. And so the children then had to start assimilating in the community. And one of them tells the story of going to a bank and saying, I need $50. What for? I want to buy a dress. Never knew how banking happened. You actually had to have money in a bank to actually take money out the bank. For years they didn't know what a birthday was. For years they didn't know what Christmas was. They were schooled 365 days of the year. The curriculum was set by a cult member who was principal of one of our senior schools, our senior secondary schools here in Melbourne, who would go up every weekend and make sure that the curriculum was set for the next week. When a dog died at the compound, the dog was laid on the bed of the child with candles around the dog, laying in state while the child slept on the floor for 3 days. So this was the bizarre activities that occurred in the cult.
It is so eerie to me, the similarities between your case In my case, Lex, you ended up with about 28 to 30 children in the cult, didn't you?
Yeah, we knew of 13, and in an interview she did in Hawaii with one of our local news networks said that 27 children passed through her hands, and we believe that the other 14 were children of cult members that weren't actually made into Hamilton-Byrne children, but we know that had spent time at the Eildon property. So, the 27 figure would be right, and the 13 that she had amassed with her husband, Bill, who portrayed them as her children, which was bizarre because she'd had a hysterectomy years before their birth, and she could never have been the mother of any of them. But the authorities here at the time in our birth, deaths, and marriages registry in government, and there's one story about this is how bizarre it was in those days. There was three children, 2 boys and 1 girl, for example. The girl and one of the boys were made into twins and registered in our neighbouring state of New South Wales, but they're also registered in New Zealand with New Zealand authorities, because one of the cult members was a doctor in New Zealand. Some years later, supported by documentation from doctors and lawyers, they wrote to the New Zealand authorities to say, at the time of giving birth to twins, I actually gave birth to triplets. So, sorry, I forgot to tell you about the third one. So the New Zealand authorities just changed the whole recording and recorded triplets, and so made 3 of the children into triplets. And why was that? The passage of travel.
So of those children, now, as we think about some of the similarities and dissimilarities, you had 27 plus. I had 32 in my cult, or the cult I investigated. We ended up being able to file criminal charges for sexual assault and other very serious crimes. You faced a much different challenge in yours. Were any of the children sexually abused that you were ever able to learn about even after the fact?
No, not in that context, Mike. And we face the issue of the way that the survivors were at that point, the children were, the dilemma of, do we put them in a witness box on various charges against cult members? Would that do more psychological damage to them where they are at that time? What was the evidence, the hard evidence we actually had? So the evidence that we had was documentation, because, as you know, documents don't lie. People lie on documents. In other words, they file falsifications on true legal documents. And that's how we were able to charge Anne, unfortunately, only with charges of perjury and a couple of other charges, but at the end of the day, it was only the charge of perjury documents. But the issue for me, Mike, and this might sound bizarre, was we had this mystic woman who was Jesus Christ reincarnated in a female form. People believed she was above the law. Well, I was challenged in 1989 by a local journalist here in Australia. It said, if you find her, you'll never charge her. If you charge her, you'll never get her back to Australia. And if you get her back to Australia, you'll never get a conviction. So that was a challenge, because I wanted to show her followers and society that she was just an evil woman. So eventually, with the assistance of the survivors and many of the other victims in the cult that were cult members, but more so the authorities in the United States, in New York, and I have to mention Hilda Kogut, who was a former special agent with the FBI in New York City. She was just amazing. We found her, we charged her with perjury, we brought her back, and she said the words guilty in the court of law. We didn't have to prove it. She pleaded guilty to the court of law. And these were in days, of course, there was no internet. It was all done either by telephone or by fax.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a remarkable story. Number one, that you were able to get an international warrant served and extradite back internationally. Having made that flight to Australia and you having made it to the U.S., that is one long flight, and just getting someone that far is an incredibly huge accomplishment. But I just loved the story, and I want you to tell people what that was like. Number one, the response you had when you showed up, and the feeling you had when you walked her onto that airplane and lifted off from New York.
Yeah, I'll go back to when the first contact I made with the US, with the FBI. We knew that Anne was in New York State because she'd made a fundamental mistake and had rung one of the survivors, one of the former children, who then rang us and said, I think she's in the United States, in the Catskills. So where do we do from here? So no internet, no nothing. So we went to the international operator and said, give us the office for the FBI in New York City. So we rang the number, and this agent picks up the phone, FBI, New York, and I said, now, before you say anything, this is who I am. Don't hang up on me because I'm not a nut, but I'm going to tell you a story about X, Y, Z and Jesus Christ. And fortunate for us, it was Hilda Kogut. And, we had then had a great arrangement for over nearly 2 months, working over the phone and over faxes with Hilda and her team. And eventually they did a raid one morning in the Catskills at Hurleyville, and they arrested Anne and William on the international arrest warrants, and they were put in the local jail, and they fought the extradition for a number of months because they said, Anne said her health was not good. She was in a separate part of the jail, of course, to her husband, William. And then one day there was a murder in William's cell, and William said, I've had enough. I want to get out of here. I want to go home. I didn't come here for this murder. And Anne was still saying, but I'm sick. I've had heart complaints. So I said, that's fine. I'll bring a doctor. So we took one of our police doctors across with us so that she had her personal physician on the way home. So after we got there, and then we did all the paperwork that has to happen, and then it was the day that we were leaving, and it was the first time I saw Anne. And this black SUV comes along to the tarmac of the airport at JFK Airport there in New York City, and the door slides open of this black vehicle, and there is this little old woman sitting there in chains, leg chains and handcuffs, and next to her was this old man. And if you saw them, you would immediately, if you didn't know their history, take pity on them. And I said to her, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, my name is Detective Lex De Man. I'm here to take you back to Australia with our colleagues. And I remember the thing she said to me was, oh, so you're Mr. De Man. You look a lot younger than I thought you would be. And the only other words that she ever really spoke to me was no comment, no comment, no comment during interviews. But we took them with the US Marshals from New York. We flew to LA because the Marshals have to accompany you to the last port. And then we left America, and as we're a couple of hours outside of Sydney, our first stop in Australia, the chief steward came and saw myself and one of my colleagues, the inspector, and said, the pilot would like to see you. So we were asked to go up to the cockpit of the jumbo. So we walked in, and the pilot said, I just want to tell you how proud I am that I am flying this bitch home, and that she's on my plane, and that gave me a sense of pride that we've even got the captain of the Qantas jet so pleased that he's playing an active part in getting this devious person and this devious couple back to Australia.
Well, this case today still is one of those national cases in Australia that you would be pressed to find someone that doesn't know or have heard about this particular investigation. And what a compliment to you for being able to put this thing together and get her home. And frankly, it's a compliment whenever the offender knows who we are, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And like you, Mike, the reason I talk about this story, it's actually not about you, and it's actually not about me. It's actually making sure that the community, our governments, our lawmakers are aware that these devious people are in our society, and then we must be on our guard every day of the week to make sure that we do everything to protect our children, and that there are people out there that would want to do our children harm. So the more we talk about it, the more awareness we have of it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And it's really about those surviving children and being able to look at them in the eye and say, we did everything we possibly could. I hope you feel that sense of accomplishment. You have had a relationship with, I keep calling mine kids, even though they're in their mid-40s now, because they were kids when I dealt with them initially. I don't think you will ever get over a feeling of responsibility for those kids, will you?
No, you never do. And I keep in contact with several of them. One I catch up with every 2 months for a breakfast and a chat. She tells me about her grown-up children now and what they're doing. She's in a new relationship, which is tremendous. Another one that lives on the other side of the country. We talk quite often. And some have just not wanted to re-engage, which is terrific. They've gone on with their lives, but they know that, if they've got any questions or they need help, they can ring. Last year I got a call from on behalf of one that I hadn't spoken to for nearly 20 years that just wanted to find out some facts and so forth. As you were probably told, being a copper, being a police officer, don't get involved in the personal side of people's lives when you do a crime. You would not be human if you did not get involved when you know what's happened to the children in your circumstance and the children in our circumstance. And, it's something, as I said, it is with both of us what we've done for the rest of our lives. But, ultimately, in my case, was justice done for the children, and for the victims, no justice wasn't done because what she did, we were never able to bring her to court because of legal matters and so forth, precedents. But, the happiest day of my life, Mike, was when she died at 98 of Alzheimer's disease.
I loved a comment that I saw. Anne Hamilton-Byrne ends up getting dementia, and she dies at 98 years old in Melbourne in 2019. And shortly after her death, you received a text message from an old friend that was only 4 minutes long. And I just love this because you have been quoted as saying it may have been the best text message you ever received. Tell me about that.
I got a text message from a former cult member, and the text message simply said, "The witch is dead." And when I received that, and it was from a number I didn't know, I knew exactly where the number was from, and I knew exactly what the message meant. I did not shed one tear. I said in our local media, "Good riddance to Anne Hamilton-Byrne, may she burn in hell." And, I stayed around for 3 days, Mike, and after 3 days, she never resurfaced. So, the mythology that she was Jesus Christ reincarnated, I don't think was actually true. But, that text message is the best text message I've ever received. Of the thousands I've received, the witch is dead.
Yeah, that is such a perfect ending to an ugly story that still has so much damage left in the wings. But I have to echo that feeling that you had. And, I think believing in goodness, she has to have faced an awfully horrid judgment for what she put so many through. And Lex, God bless you for what you did, for those who served with you and what they did. And, sadly, I feel kind of guilty at times because there were a lot of people that put in hundreds and thousands of hours in an investigation that people just point to me and say, well, you led the case. We were fortunate to lead a case surrounded by so many amazing police officers and investigators.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll tell you, this is something, folks, I hope you'll look up the family and Ann Hamilton-Byrne and read up on Lex's investigation. There are documentaries that are out that you can watch on YouTube. You can read all kinds of newspaper articles. Lex, one thing I want to do is I want you to send me the final newspaper article where you have that final say about her being deceased. And I'm going to send you one when the local paper contacted me when the cult leader died in prison, and they wanted a response from me. And I think we both must have attended the same police academy.
It's part of that brotherhood, isn't it?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for coming on Profiling Evil. The question I have to ask is, will you come back? Because we got to talk about other cases at some point.
Oh, Mike, absolutely. And it's even though we haven't met in person, I feel as though, we know each other quite well. So absolutely.
Thanks, Lex. Thanks for listening to the Profiling Evil podcast. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And please don't forget to go to our YouTube channel where you can watch some of the hundreds of videos we've created. Now, if you're looking for a great crime story, check out my new book, Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. You can find it at profilingevil.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for our elite newsletter, the B.O.L.O. I'm Mike King, and thanks for listening.